Thank you. Mr. Chairman, Professor Waters mentioned the cases of violence and vandalism directed at abortion clinics that gave rise to the FACE Act, but I think she left out all of the cases of violence and vandalism that were directed at churches and pregnancy centers, and that's what convinced Congress to make FACE even-handed and to protect both sides of the controversy. Am I correct, Ms. Hawley?
That's absolutely correct. The plain text of the FACE Act applies to pregnancy centers.
To everybody, both sides. There's no right to impede a person's access to abortion clinics or pregnancy centers or churches or any other lawful pursuit. There's no right to vandalize those facilities or threaten to the people who use them. And there is every right to peaceably assemble to express one's political or religious beliefs. So I've got no problems with the FACE Act on its face, so to speak. As I read it, it forbids blockading abortion clinics and churches. As I read it, it protects the right of individuals to peaceably assemble. So what am I missing here?
So I'm afraid that the promise of equal application of the FACE Act has really been a false one. As Chairman Roy discussed, there have been 55 individuals prosecuted.
Okay, so is that the fault of the act itself, or is that the fault of the way the act is enforced?
That specific concern is the fault of the enforcement.
Okay, that's what I thought. You know, I heard Mr. Nadler say that, well, instead of repealing the FACE Act, and I'm not the least bit sure that we should, Republicans ought to urge the Trump administration to prioritize enforcement of the FACE Act on behalf of pro-life activists. Well, I find this just as offensive as prioritizing enforcement of the FACE Act on behalf of pro-abortion activists. Both courses are deeply destructive to the rule of law and to the concept of equal protection of the law. This is the reason justice is always depicted as being blindfolded, because it shouldn't matter what anyone's personal opinions are. The laws are to be applied equally to all. I hope I misunderstood what the ranking member said in his prepared remarks, because it seems to confirm the complaint that this law is susceptible to political abuse. In fact, he sounded like he was encouraging us to abuse it, which I find bizarre. So, you know, if we're to slant enforcement of the law, depending upon who's in power, it seems to me we've lost the fundamental principle of equal justice under law. And this problem, I think, is not limited to the FACE Act, though. It's, we've seen selective enforcement in the different treatment between, say, George Floyd rioters and January 6th rioters, or the Lois Lerner's selective enforcement against Tea Party activists a few years ago. Should we perhaps, instead of looking at repealing the FACE Act, look at clearly defining what selective enforcement looks like and then applying criminal or civil penalties to such conduct?
So I think that could be a good first step, and I agree wholeheartedly that the FACE Act, as is every criminal statute, should be applied even-handedly. That's the promise of our republic. I would say,
because it's being administered by people with political biases, that's perhaps not always going to happen. And it certainly is not happening in this case, but also it's not happening in a lot of other cases. So you know, is there some law that you could recommend that would define what selective enforcement is and sanction those who apply it in a biased manner?
So that's an interesting question. Selective enforcement is typically raised as a constitutional claim, either under the Equal Protection Clause or the First Amendment. And so if you had a federal selective enforcement claim itself, you'd have to think how that would play out. But I do think that the constitutional cases provide a good sort of framework of reference. And what those cases provide is that when parties are similarly situated, there is prosecutorial discretion, but when you have similarly situated parties, the law requires that they be treated equally.
Mr. Cranford, very briefly, your thoughts on the subject.
Would you repeat the question, please, sir?
The question is, since these laws are subject to enforcement by individuals who have their own biases, is there a law we should be looking at that would identify what selective enforcement looks like and sanction it?
And actually, it is a very difficult area, as Ms. Hawley mentioned. The selective enforcement case law, the precedents are frankly not entirely consistent, and there is, because of the discretion afforded prosecutors across the board, a great deal of disagreement as to when that's too far, and they've transgressed the constitutional limits. It's frankly a matter for the courts, and we really do need more clarity in that area. I can't point you to another statute or a law that would help
Any
at
further
this point.
thoughts you have on that, I'd be interested in hearing.